Due to the COVID-19 pandemic and state of emergency, this meeting is being held by a live video teleconference pursuant to 2020 Senate Bill 150 and in accordance with KRS 61826 because it's not feasible to offer a primary physical location for the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Shall we start off by approving the June 23rd, 2021 meeting minutes? I found them to be very thorough, as always, in my review. Hopefully everyone else was able to review them and found the same. If not, are there any comments? If there's no comments, can I get a motion to accept the meeting minutes as proposed?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor, please raise your hand.
Aye.
If there's any opposed, please speak up now and raise your hand also. Unanimously approved, as always. Thank you very much for some wonderful minutes, Craig. Shall we move on to Mark and the Stantec team?
Sure. So I think on today's agenda, we are going to, the main event is to go through the evaluation of the scenarios using the weights and point scores from the weights we received from the task force members, and then the point scores that were derived from the metrics, and to use this as the demonstration of how the framework is supposed to work in some, in the metrics that we're using. So that is the primary agenda item, and then the second agenda item would be Monday's community input meeting. We'll just go over, roughly the rough agenda of what we're going to do for that, and then whatever topics you would like to consider after that. So to get started, we'll go with the scenario evaluation that you should have received, I think, on Monday, and I'll share my screen. So these are the slides we have presented before. I have updated the language per the discussion from previous task force meetings to create another level between the idea that the framework is itself the mechanism for making the decision to maintain or expand the urban service boundary, and to again reiterate that this is a separate. This is its own framework process. It works independent of, but in conjunction with the comprehensive planning process. Our intentions have not changed. The third, except for the third statement, is if and when consideration of expansion is necessary. So our evaluation framework, again, we've gone through this. We are now at the step of number 4 of evaluating the scenarios through the framework. And the framework itself, again, just quickly recap, is generally broken into 2 main parts. Does it meet the capacity, does the capacity within the urban service boundary as delineated meet the capacity needs for demand for our 4 main land use areas? And we have 2, these are based on the trend lines that we've projected based on conservative and full trend lines. So they are to one side of it would be to meet 100% of the low growth trend line, and the other side would be to meet 75% of the high growth trend line. With that understood, or those answers created, we would move to the second phase, which is how does the scenario being evaluated reflect the goals of meeting the comp plan? And we have set a criteria that says along this point system that we have, we should be trying to get to 60% of the total possible score. So the first part, we have these 4 categories in 2 questions each. Do they meet this demand? Yes or no, for 100% of conservative and 75% of the full. And so getting right into it, we have on this table, on the top line, we have the demand from these trend lines. Oh shoot, I screwed this up already. I was supposed to I added a couple of words here to describe the difference between conservative and full. And the reality is it should be the conservative is representing a 10-year trend line, and the full is representing a 20-year trend line. So excuse me, that is what the full is looking at data from the past 20 years in general versus the past 10 years. And in this case, we're talking about the estimates from the American Community Survey, that the 1-year estimates that we get for 2010 through 2019. Again, that's the last year of the survey because the 2020 census will supersede that. The full, in this case, is actually based on the Kentucky State Data Center's extrapolation of the 2010 census and the 2015 American Community Survey estimate. So it's a little bit older in terms of the data it uses, but it is also what the comprehensive plan used as its extrapolation. And so as we see, there is a disparity there in the amount in the trend lines from those two sources. And that is where we get our conservative and full. But as we can see on the supply side, filling out the number of residential units that there is capacity for inside each of these scenarios, we see that only scenario 1, which produces 27,600 units, is the only one that does not meet the capacity demands of either the conservative or the 75% of the full. And again, just to remind everyone, the 75% is intended to indicate that there is still time for trend lines to change, and we wouldn't necessarily want to say, oh, if we don't have 100% capacity 20 years today for what will be occurring in 20 years, that we should immediately assume we have to consider expansion. It's more to say, on that high end, are we close to the being able to meet that capacity? And in this case, scenario 3 actually meets the full as well. Scenario 2 gets very close to meeting the full. As you can see, it has 39,000. For office, again, the trend lines, it's 10 and 20 years. I apologize. The conservative is 2.5 million square feet. The full is 4.6 million square feet. 75% of that would be 3.45. And as we can see, each of these scenarios easily has enough capacity to meet those demand metrics. This is primarily simply because of the available land that is available today in these business classes. And it's not necessarily an indication of what we would expect to be built. As we understand from the Lexington market, in the office development tends to follow the demand for office development. So if in fact, as we go forward, there's less demand, we would expect to see less supply come online. But in these scenarios, we use different expectations of density to calculate a total capacity. And in particular for scenario 3, as an example, we are including more mixed use redevelopment of infill sites, including perhaps the conversion of downtown parking lots, surface parking lots, unattached surface parking lots that could ultimately become a new mixed use building, which could have some office space in it. For retail, similar, the trend lines for retail, the past 10-year trend line would indicate a conservative demand for 2.2 million square feet, while the 20-year trend line would indicate a demand for 5 million square feet. So the 75% of that would be 3.75. And again, the amount of designated vacant space available for commercial use. Again, commercial zones have a variety of uses allowed in them. And so we have provided a conservative estimate between office and retail of what would be in each of these categories, depending on the type of land use it truly is. But there's flexibility there. And as you can see, we meet the supply for all three scenarios, although in scenarios 1 and 2, it's close to the full trend line, but it's well above the 75% trend line. And again, retail in particular, we would be wise to consider the recent trends towards online retail and other other redevelopment opportunities that in the next 5 years we will know more about the true the impact of where the future of retail is going. So again, we've created these two trend lines because we want to create one. We want to acknowledge that we don't know the true number. It's going to be something that could be anywhere in between these two numbers. And we expect in the next 5 years, especially as we come back out of the pandemic and development starts to increase, which trend line we're actually running closer to. But in either case, all three scenarios provide a sufficient capacity. And then finally, industrial demand. And here again, we have a very wide trend line for reasons we've talked about before. Again, we expect the development of the dairy farm to be a very informative development for determining the true demand, whether it's closer to the lower end or the high end. Regardless, in this case, only in scenario 3, where we are, which is a scenario that emphasizes density and in this case emphasizes the more efficient use of industrial space on the industrial land, we would expect to see us being able to meet the 75% threshold. So assuming we have a scenario and we have these three scenarios that are intend to represent various points along the spectrum of what's possible from scenario 1, which is really, again, just the continuation of the current zoning, what is allowed under current zoning densities for the current zoning locations, to scenario 3, which increases density on those locations, but also and some more flexibility on what the types of uses, as well as the presumption of a proactive infill redevelopment plan on corridors and in other explicit sites in the city that have been identified in previous or outside studies. So if we say we have a scenario and we say, okay, we believe it meets the capacity needs, the second phase of that to say whether that is a relevant scenario for consideration of how we would expect development to occur in Lexington. We would also want to know, well, does it actually also advance the goals of the Imagine Lexington, the comprehensive plan, which is how we got to these questions that we're going to answer, for which you have given weights, and we have assigned a metric, and we have applied those weights to the points from that analysis to get a score. One thing we've changed as a suggestion to distinguish between the capacity side of this framework and this comprehensive plan alignment side is to change the nomenclature for the questions to letters as opposed to just a continuation of the numbers. So that's different from what you got on Monday, but when we get this totally revised, we'll put this one up on the website, and this is how we'll continue forward. So going forward with those questions, we start with the first question: does the scenario prioritize higher density development? In this case, our basic metric is the density of the development we are planning, or not planning, but the density of development we are presuming in each of these scenarios, and in particular, the dwellings per acre. So that's a residential metric. So the table on the left indicates what the existing citywide density on developed residential tracts. So these are zoned residential tracts where there is a residence on it. Now it could include like a zoning class that isn't explicitly a residential class, but it has to have an actual residential unit on it, and then exclusively on it, not a mixed use unit where it's a part of a larger commercial development. But either way, for residential uses, the existing citywide density is about 5.9 units per acre. As we see in these scenarios for the new acreage, and these are almost entirely residential zones that are currently vacant, which include the agricultural zones. The densities in scenarios 1, 2, and 3 are higher. They go from 6.5 in scenario 1 to 8.4 in scenario 2 and 9.1 in scenario 3. And in scenario 3, there are also, of course, additional units in mixed-use redevelopment along in the corridors and other catalyst sites inside of the urban service boundary in the more developed areas. On the right side of the table of the slide, we see just those metrics for units of housing and for total commercial square feet demonstrated for each scenario. And as we can see, we have significantly more commercial space in scenario 3. Some of that is because we have increased the efficiency assumptions for industrial. Some of it is because of the infill development that is being presumed. And some of it is just simply increased density in each of the allowable zoning categories. So here at the bottom of the screen, we see how we came up to our final scores. And the weight from the averaged weight we got from our responses was 7.1 out of 10. And in this case, we look at this question as a whole. We see that scenario 1, which does nothing but allow for what is currently created, what is currently allowed for any of these categories, does not prioritize density. We know that from the fact that we know it doesn't prioritize density explicitly in a sense of trying to meet what we need to have to meet our demand. So it gets 0 points. Scenario 2 clearly tries to prioritize density by increasing the densities and the flexibilities of land uses to a certain level. And so it gets 3, and we gave scenario 4 4 points because in addition to increased density, it also, includes redevelopment of underutilized parcels along corridors and in catalyst sites. So that is how we determined the points that we gave it, and then applied that weight times 7.1 to get our score. So I'm going to stop here for a second because I'm going to continue to go through these slides and go through the same process, but this is generally the process for how we score or get to our final scores. And I want to make sure anybody has any questions about how we did that. We can try to answer them now.
And just to reiterate, I know Mark mentioned this already, but the very first item at the bottom left of this slide, the weighting is based on the average weighting that we received from the responses that we received from the task force members. So we did receive 11 responses that are represented there in that weight.
And if we have time at the end, we can also, Craig, we can look at those individual, like the distribution of those. As Craig mentioned, the distribution is fairly consistent in the terms of when we drop out the outliers, the highest and lowest, it doesn't radically change the scores, no more than a few decimal points. So, all right, so the second question, how does the scenario prioritize a diversity of housing types? So here the metric is simply what is the proportion of housing types for the new development that we are envisioning in each of these scenarios. So we can add up all the different zoning units in each zoning class, including mixed use zones. And we have kept it as simple, so it's simpler to understand and also out to track. And as we can see, in scenario 1 at the bottom, we have the highest percentage of single family detached housing types, but that's still the lowest number of actual total units. And that's obviously because it's the scenario 1 has the least number of units and it is the least dense of them. So as we create more density, we create more total units. But as we continue up the graph there, scenario 2 increases density. the increased density is implied for more multifamily and more single family attached units, as well as more mixed use residential opportunities. In particular, I believe we have some on the south there for the business zoning class at the large parcel at the very south end of the Nicholasville Road on the Jessamine County border. I think there's a significant mixed use units in that that's allowable by the zoning. So that's what we're seeing there. And then in scenario 3, really what we've done is we've added these mixed use units to the redevelopment areas. Again, it's not 100% of all redevelopment potential. It's a small percentage of what we would say it would be reasonable to expect at the high end, if that wasn't truly the goal of the city actors, both in the public and the private sectors, to try to develop that, and obviously also in the market to consume that. But in that case, for scenario 3, we see, of course, significantly more mixed use and therefore the greatest diversity of housing types. But it isn't, I think, relevant to note that although the single family housing type percentage-wise goes down, it's still due to the increased number of units, the density overall, and in particular in the R3 category, we still see the highest actual number of single family units. This was weighted fairly high. Again, scenario 1, it's 1 point, again, because it's not really prioritizing a diversity of housing types. It's simply continuing the metric, but it does have, it does probably include a higher mix of diversified housing types than maybe we've received in the last 20, 30 years, but it's marginally more, and then mainly only due to where the zoning currently stands of what can be done. Scenario 2 increases density, which of course, again, allows for more diversity. And scenario 3 with the infill really creates that mixed use, so it gets 4 points. So as you can see how that translates when we times that by 8.3, the scores are on the right. Third question, does the scenario provide affordable, accessible housing? We talked to a lot of people, we wrestled with this in trying to figure out a way to quantify exactly how much affordable housing could be occurring in any scenario. Just became an exercise that we thought was getting too obscure by assumptions that in variables we can't really control or ascertain. And it really just came down to the potential for affordable housing is greatest when you have more units, so that you can apply, so that more units, whatever proportion of housing that is affordable, there's a better chance that there'll be more units of it if there are more total units. And then if there's more multifamily units, if there's more smaller units that are more likely to be in the multifamily or different types of housing types beyond simply single family detached. And we can just imagine that where you have the opportunity for multifamily housing or attached housing, that could be zones that are more likely to be able to have affordable housing, but also perhaps more senior living type communities, et cetera, than the simple zones that only have single family detached houses. So with that being said, we can look at the breakdown again of the diversity and make the decision that obviously in this case, scenario 3 has the most diversity, and it also has the highest number of units. Scenario 2 also has more units than scenario 1. So we give scenario 1 a point for the amount of units it is adding to the inventory, but clearly the most points go to 3 and 4 for adding more units and more units that are not single family detached. And the weight with here is fairly high, 8.1, which translates to the scores on the right. And as you'll notice, we recycle these metrics. That's for a couple reasons, because they're relevant, but also because it does keep it simpler for when we hand this over to the planning staff, that there's only so much that they have to maintain, track and maintain as they do these analyses going forward. And that's part of what we want, what we think will make this framework something that'll be used consistently going forward. Fourth question: does the scenario accommodate off-campus student housing? This was the score by far the lowest, and I've heard some explanations for why, but either way, when we actually, if the metric is how many new units are within a certain distance of the campus, we measured that, and really our program did not. We have new units, particularly in scenario 3, that are for programs, Red Mile, if it was to be redeveloped along Nicholasville Road corridor, along downtown. So it has the most, but in general, we can see that it's a relatively progressive increase of total units between scenarios 1, 2, and 3. So this one, we've rated, the points we assigned were 1, 2, and 3 for each of the scenarios going forward. And as you can see, the scores are relatively low because the weight is very low. Question 5, does the scenario prioritize mixed use development? And here this is fairly straightforward in the sense that it's how many units are we considering in a mixed use style development. That could be either in a development on a vacant parcel that's zoned for mixed use, or that allows for residential as a component of like a larger array of uses, or it could be within our the scenarios 3 areas where we have depicted redevelopment, infill redevelopment potential. So the map on the right shows the locations that we included explicitly for redevelopment potential. That includes downtown, and it includes the corridors you see on New Circle and Nicholasville Road. But we've also highlighted the larger parcels that we either have more direct information from a plan, or we have assigned proportions of the gross total numbers, which are not identical to what Imagine Nicholasville Road had for Nicholasville Road, but a similar premise of redevelopment of those large commercial spaces. Similarly on Richmond Road and even in Hamburg. So you can see how we've made some decisions. Again, we're not even assigning 100% of what these groups are saying is possible. We're generally assigning 20 to 30% of what these plans were assigning, unless it was very much an explicit plan, such as the UK site up on the north side of town. But on the left, even when we total those up, we can see obviously the dramatic number of mixed use units in scenario 3 compared to the other 2. But scenario 2 still has a significant number. So does the scenario prioritize mixed use development? Scenario 1 gets 1 point for having some. Scenario 2 gets 3 points for having a significantly more. And then scenario 3, with its inclusion of infill development, gets the full, the highest point you can get. So the weight there was 6, moderate score, moderate weight, and that translates on the right. All right, so now to the next question. Does the scenario help Lexington maximize development on vacant land within the urban service area and promote redevelopment of underutilized land? This is the highest weighted question, I believe. And gets to the core of why we are all here. So in this metric, really what we're seeing is 2 issues. One is how much are you trying to develop on these parcels, And then second, like, are you actually reutilizing, are you trying to redevelop on underutilized land? In this sense, again, scenario 1 does not maximize vacant land use because it is merely continuing the development densities that are on the books today, which at least for residential would not meet the capacity needs of the expected demand for going forward in the next 20 years. Scenario 2 does do more to maximize the development on vacant land, but it doesn't really do as much on infill redevelopment. And scenario 3 does both. So it's combined, it gets the full points. Scenario 2 gets 2 points. Scenario 1 gets 0 points. Does the scenario emphasize redevelopment on underutilized corridors? On this one, it's fairly simple. The only scenario in which we assigned new development on underutilized or on these corridors, underutilized corridors, is scenario 3. And so we gave that full points. The weight was fairly high. Scenarios 1 and 2 got 0 points. Does the scenario help concentrate efforts to enhance mass transit along our corridors? Again, we did not evaluate like a BRT line or other kind of like explicit transit programs. That's not really the issue with, that's not the primary method, core issue of this land use calculation that we're doing. But so the metric that we think is most relevant here is from the residential level, if you lived near a transit line, you could use it. If you don't live near a transit line, you're very less likely to use it, on any regular basis. So this one was fairly simple. We drew a buffer of 0.25 miles from all the transit lines in the city. This is the industry standard for what they considered walk accessible. And then we counted all the new units within each scenario. So there again, it's a relatively simple progression. Most the city's coverage of transit is, where you would expect it to be, to match where people are living. So it's not a surprise that these new units would be, we would expect to find lots of new units where there are transit lines. And of course, we would expect to find scenario 3, which develops along major corridors, to have the most. So again, we see a relatively even progression from 14,000 in scenario 1 to 24,000 in scenario 3. So we assigned 1, 2, and 3 to those scenarios. The weight is 6.9, and that creates our scores on the right. Does the scenario help prioritize multimodal options that de-emphasize single occupancy vehicle dependence? Again, I should also mention that these questions are related to goals in the comp plan. I didn't write the particular goals on these slides, but they are in the actual questions from the evaluation framework form that we started, and we can certainly add them to our official framework. But so this is similar to the transit question. And in addition to transit, this one implies how well are you able to use other modes besides automobiles, such as walking and biking. And we realized the metric we had the most access to understanding would be that the number of units that are in a mixed use environment that would allow for more convenience for walking or biking, particularly walking. And in addition to that, the access to transit. So we've combined the transit metric with our mixed use metric, and again with the total number of units in mixed use, we've changed the score slightly to 1, 3, and 4. I'm sorry, the points slightly 1, 3, and 4 for each of these scenarios. The weighting is similar to the transit. I think it's just a tad higher, and you can see the scores on the right. And I was supposed to change this slide, and Craig, I apologize. I knew I missed one. So this is not an accurate depiction of the dairy farm property. This, like the actual, it's this part and this part. But the question is, does the scenario provide and sustain readily available publicly controlled economic development land? And in all three scenarios, we know about LFUCG's acquisition of the dairy farm that will become an industrial park, controlled by the city. So that is something that is happening. It's going forward. There's no distinction between the scenarios in that regard. So we gave each of the scenarios 2 points because obviously, in theory, that we're not really changing anything from what is currently there today. But certainly, it should get points for having this development. And then finally, the last question: does the scenario have a positive impact on LFUCG finances? So this is where our partners with Urban 3 performed the analysis where they organized the different small geographic clusters within the city based on the land use a singular or unifying land use. This was for the purpose of creating some anonymity for the collection of the occupational license fees to protect people's proprietary information. But it also allows us to create a baseline of what the different land use types actually generate in terms of average revenue. So when we do our build out scenarios, we gave that back to Urban 3. They applied those revenue factors for the various types to the new build out scenarios and established what the average costs and then what the average revenue expectation by the virtue of the land use would be. So costs would be more likely tied to whether it was requiring new infrastructure or whether it was able to take advantage of existing infrastructure. In any case, it does not imply the cost of adding new infrastructure, as in particular expansion areas. The exactions program assumes that all infrastructure will be paid for as a part of the development of in those areas. But it does presume that that additional infrastructure will have to be maintained and ultimately replaced in perpetuity going forward. So their cost is associated with the future liability of having to maintain more infrastructure that is just unavoidable if you're going to have it put in the ground. So it's not the actual capital expense of constructing it, it's the cost of maintaining it. And in that regard, really where we see how these scenarios affect LFUCG's finances, it's how much the revenue side changes, because the provision of infrastructure is fairly uniform across all the city. It's the question of how much density you put on it and how much new development you put on places that didn't have, or that had infrastructure but didn't have, weren't fully utilizing the space available to get revenue from it. And further, as we know, the land use types that generate the most revenue are going to be land uses that have employment, because the city's finances are skewed on the revenue side to the occupational license fee. So while there's certainly merit to residential and agricultural uses, the amount of revenue the city receives from them is considerably lower than what it receives from employment centers. And that being said, in scenario one, where we really are just developing out mostly residential development and using only the current densities for any other commercial properties, we do not, for the provision of infrastructure that we have to put out and maintain, compared to the revenue, which is almost entirely occupational license or property taxes. By comparison, we actually incur an annual net, a negative net cost of around $20 million. When we add density, when the only thing we do is in scenario two is just add more density, basically add more people paying into the coffers through their property taxes, we actually see that we can get basically back to neutral. We see a slight surplus on an annual basis from revenues versus that annualized cost. And then in scenario 3, where we make the concerted effort to go back and put higher revenue, because a lot of these are mixed use developments that will have both property taxes and additional employment associated with them, we would see the greatest return because we're getting more revenue out of the same infrastructure, and we also have greater density. So this is a good indicator of how infill development and higher density development is more cost effective from the provision of infrastructure, the provision of services, than simply like the current standard single family residential or agricultural uses and how the revenue we generate from that. With that being said, the scores we gave were 0 for scenario 1, because of course it had a negative impact on LFUCG finances. Scenario 2 had a neutral impact, so it gets 2 points, and scenario 3 gets 4 points for providing a surplus impact on the development. And so
I'm seeing that Lynn Phillips has her hand up for.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have not been looking at that side screen at all. So yes, please.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for acknowledging me. Mark, can you explain how you figured out what the property tax for the scenarios 2 and 3 would be, as well as the occupational license fees? How did you project forward to what those would look like?
So that's where, and Philip can speak to this, especially Philip, if I don't know if Craig, is he available, Philip Walters, to speak?
Can you hear me, Mark?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Do you want to take this, or do you want me to give it a shot and tell me if I'm wrong?
Let me try at the highest level, and we'll see if that's satisfying or not for Lynn. Using what we already know about the existing model that I think we showed a long time ago, this kind of parcel, this kind of building generates this much property tax for just the city, and it is just that thin sliver. As we go forward in these scenarios, they would require certain buildings that are essentially just like buildings you have now. So we are essentially able to copy paste, for lack of a better word, those existing buildings into that future. So that is essentially in a current dollar terms, but based on current examples from the market.
So yeah, I understand what you're saying, but is scenario 2 then like 1.3 times what we currently have? I mean, how did you project that forward? Specifically for, I'm thinking scenario 3.
Well, I think what you're asking is if the development pattern in scenario 3 is distinctly different, it has more mixed use style developments, it has more intense, more square footage of industrial space, it has more office square footage, that would be reflected in higher revenues because it would be times by that higher variable for that type of use. So they're getting all that aggregated, they aggregated out into the various uses.
Okay, so that's my question is,
Yeah.
I guess you articulated it better than me. So you took each of the specific kinds of land uses, what the intended costs and revenues would be, and aggregated that, and that's how you came up with the numbers for scenario 2 and 3.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And it's also for scenario 1, to be clear, because scenario 1, today existing, they're vacant fields. So their costs and revenues are different than when they'd be developed and they've got something on them, whether they're a single family house or a building or an office building. It's still, so scenario 1 has a build out, it is a build out scenario. It is different than existing. And that's where, but what we're showing here is the revenue and costs associated with only those developments that have been changed.
You mean redeveloped, or you mean infill?
Right, like either
undeveloped?
newly
Okay.
developed or redeveloped, yes.
Okay, yeah, I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around that, but keep going. I'm sorry to hold you up.
No problem. Vice Mayor?
Thank you. So I guess I was going to wait until you finished with all of these, but this is the last one.
Yeah, the only
believe.
slide left is the summary.
Okay, well, maybe before you get to the summary. guess the question that I've been trying to figure out is how many of these individual A through J actually depend on the same metric? And if there is an underlying metric, how would you describe it?
Well, yeah, several of them, as we can see going through, several of them, like transit is used twice. The mixed use development numbers, I think, is used 2 or 3 times. The total number of houses is used, total number of units is used multiple times. The location, whether it's on underutilized corridors, whether it's a mixed use, that's again the more in the mixed use category. So there are several of them that are used over multiple of these questions, and I would say that the underlying theme is the total number and the location, whether it's a new, where it is, whether it's on the existing corridor and how much, and then to a lesser, another one would be the diversity that is created from the availability of the different housing types.
Okay, I'm looking for a way to simplify, and I don't know if that's the direction to go in. But a related question about this, I guess we were on revenue. Is there a way to think about the kind of the per square foot employment that's offered? So what I'm thinking about again is the industrial development as opposed to, let's say, office development.
Yeah, so we had I could have probably should have added that there's a table that shows it's not per square foot, it's per acre. That's Philip, if I'm correct, that's like the standard unit that you used for each of these land uses. And we could see where the revenue is generated from each of those land use types. In office was by far the highest because obviously it concentrates the most workers and generally higher paid workers in the smallest area. But yeah, we have that revenue. We have that revenue broken out by acreage, by land use type that was used to develop these numbers.
Okay, and then so if we're looking at scenarios, is that built in? Maybe I'm not understanding. Is that built in part to the analysis? So if I'm looking at a way to positively affect the revenue stream in terms of policy, should I be emphasizing office development and the kinds of jobs and businesses that would use less not square footage, you like acreage, less acreage than industrial development, which does not have the same high yield?
With this framework, when you create a scenario to test through the framework, and you're making a development assumption for a particular property. So, for example, let's say EA3, which we could either develop as industrial space, or maybe it gets reclassified and becomes office, an office park. Like it would be designated, the type of land use would therefore be designated in that development assumption as industrial or office park, and that factor of revenue would be applied to those parcels accordingly. So in that sense, if you wanted to see what would happen if you dedicated more space to one type of land use versus another, you would see the revenue effect of that. But it's also, it would also be important to note that just because you make everything office doesn't imply that that's a reasonable expectation of what would actually happen. Obviously, there has to be the private sector demand for office, or it just won't get developed. But in the terms of this framework, if you make an assumption of this parcel will be used for office, then its factor for office space would be what was applied to create these numbers.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Mr. Penn?
Frank?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm I want to go back to where you talk about the corridor development in scenario 2. That's one of our focal points in the current comp plan. In fact, we've redone the B6P to reflect that. And to say in scenario 2, that it's hard to believe that no development in those corridor scenarios is not in question G, because that's a focal point and we are already moving toward that. So it's hard for me to believe that we don't recognize any development in our corridors.
It's not. I mean, I understand what your point. And perhaps that is fair to say that there would be some expectation of some development within these corridors. It was simply an assumption of the scenario that we were only increasing densities on vacant land and not doing any redevelopment. So in this particular scenario, it wasn't a point of it wasn't a priority point. Scenario 3, it is, so therefore it gets credit for it.
Well, I just think we're shortchanging scenario number 2, because on the ground it's actually part of the plan.
Fair enough. I mean, and that's the thing is, if we were to say, okay, scenario 2 includes some lower level of development on these corridors, then yes, it should get points, and we can go back and change that. But that's kind of part of the iterative nature of this exercise, right? Is that it's all about the assumptions you place in each of these scenarios. So I
understand that. All I'm doing is making a point here. I'm not asking you to change anything.
Okay.
All I'm saying is that I just want to raise it as a opinion.
Understood.
I guess is the right way.
Sure. No.
Thank you.
No problem.
Can I jump back in?
Sure.
Now that Frank has raised a question, and this is a larger question about the entire framework, really. So I guess in my mind, the question really is what we have here the beginning of the baseline, or is what we have here a method for determining the baseline? That is, are we going to then to have planning staff or whomever go through the same exercise with this framework and come up with a set of numbers that may or may not be similar to the ones that you have developed in terms of your analysis of the points to give to each of these things?
Yes, correct. Like when in the future, planning staff, the analyst goes through this process, they'll have new metrics, they'll have new assumptions in any particular scenario. Their baseline may be, a scenario 1 baseline may be 5 years from now. And again, we're not saying that it's next time they do this is 5 years now, but in 5 years from now, when a considerable period of time and new development has come online, their baseline may be significantly different in what we projected, or it could be exactly what we projected in a scenario 2 or 3, and that becomes their baseline, and they could score the whatever remaining land is left, whatever redevelopment options they want to include, either as part of that baseline scenario or as part of like an iterative assumption scenario. And then yes, they would have to score those points. They would score those points according to those metrics as they assumed, according to the assumptions they made. And so when we've talked to planning, as we've gone over this with them, one of their questions was, one of the methods they could use to as an analysis, which kind of gets back to, I think your question is, they could say, okay, based on the assumptions of these 3 scenarios, as we see things come online, we can distinguish, in scenario, this basically was developed equivalent to what we see in scenario 1, or this was developed as equivalent to what we see in scenario 2 or 3. And they can then note, okay, we're actually on that trajectory more than another trajectory. In addition, because we are moving forward and your time frame is moving out, they will also have to accommodate development beyond 2040 as they go forward. And that will be, assuming at this point the boundary is the same, they will have to accommodate additional demand on land that is no longer vacant because it has been developed in the interim period. And that's where I would say you would see like, the need to make different assumptions according to what are the pieces you have left to work with. But it would still be the implication that you would make those assumptions on what to do with those pieces and then score them according to how well you believe they reflect the goals of the comp plan using the metrics that we've identified.
Just to be clear, though, the intention is to update this on an annual basis, to go back in and any changes that have occurred will be reflected in that baseline. So it'll provide a tool where we're able to see what's actually happening on the ground on an annual basis and see how that's working with the projections that have been made.
But just to be, I'm sorry, but just to be clear, the assumptions that are now within what we have been presented with would be the starting place.
Presumably, yes.
Those assumptions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't,
Right.
from our conversations with planning, I did not get the impression that they were like, well, okay, thank you for this demonstration. We're going to come up with a whole different assumptions. But
No.
at the same time, these are not, these are theoretical scenarios. They're not obviously an explicit development plan. And as things occur, those assumptions wouldn't likely reflect, new information. I want to just get, if there's any more questions, just to maybe spur some more conversation. When we go to the summary and we add up all the points for the various questions, we get that score at the bottom. We were tantalizingly close to a very round number of 300 total possible points. We got to 296.4. That's based on the weights. Ultimately, the percentages are just a reflection of what percentage of the total possible score each of these scenarios was able to get. And as we can see, with a bunch of ones and zeros, scenario 1 only got 16% of the total possible score. Scenario 2 was able to get to 54%. And Mr. Penn, to your point, had we made had we included more assumption of development along infill development along underutilized corridors and gave it 2 points, it is likely that it would have crossed the threshold of that 60%. So yes, the assumptions you make obviously matter to the final score because clearly it got close but didn't reach that threshold. And then finally, the scenario that we developed that most directly aligns with the goals of infill development and increased density. So it gets higher points. It's weighted against the weights that you provided, scores the highest, easily exceeding that 60% threshold. So if we were to imagine a scenario where the Planning Commission asked the question to the planning staff, is there a scenario that meets the goals of the comp plan and also provides enough capacity to meet our future demand for the cycle, the 20-year cycle of this comp plan? The scenario that best meets that comp plan, those comp plan goals, does in fact also meet the capacity needs of the comp plan. However, the framework also demonstrates that you can see it's still there to set up the premise that if we are developing along a scenario line that doesn't do some of these things, doesn't create more density, doesn't attempt to do more infill redevelopment, it will definitely not score well on the meeting the goals of the comp plan, but it will also indicate that that scenario does not have the capacity within the urban service boundary. And so this framework would suggest, well, why don't we try to impart more priorities of the comp plan and see if that improves? And it demonstrates that by doing so, you do get a better score. But you could see a day where you've already increased density, you've already done redevelopment, but you've used up all of the available land and you're still not going to be able to meet your capacity needs. So while you may score 60% or higher, you still will have to consider expansion. And that's when we would suggest, that you could still use this framework with a defined, small area plan for where you're expanding to see, okay, now we can, does this expansion area meet the capacity deficiencies that we were trying to meet? And does it still align with the goals of the comp plan that we're trying to follow?
Sorry, I've got my hand up.
Oh, sure,
I
yes.
need to just jump back in.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm sorry, yes.
And, it's obligatory as a politician for me to say I don't mean to be talking so much. But I do. So just to make a policy point, if we go all the way back up to the number 60% as a trigger, and we lower that to 50%, that changes a lot. That
Absolutely.
basically says we have less confidence in the projections. We are not going to jump to this move, which is a difficult one for the community. And it gives us more latitude. And so that number is itself a policy number. And I just want to emphasize that and suggest that if we want to argue about that, maybe now is, if not now is the time, then maybe after the public meeting. But I think that is a very consequential number. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that is, that number has been highlighted each time we presented this slide, and that's for good reason. That's an item that we would like this task force to discuss and make a recommendation before this comes out of the task force and moves on to the planning commission. We'd like to see a consensus among the task force members regarding that threshold, whether it should be 60% as it's proposed initially, or whether it would be better served at a lower number, or wherever you'd like that.
Craig, should that be before the public meeting?
It would be best to have consensus when we go to the public meeting, so that we're presenting a unified vision for this task force. And then the intent would be to bring back the input that we receive on that on Monday night. We would bring it back to your next week's meeting, essentially, and provide you with the feedback that we received.
Isn't the planning commission or the council going to have to determine that threshold for them to actually accept this as truth, including the weighting system?
They are ultimately, the discussion will be had by the planning commission. But I think they would be looking to this task force for recommendations in that regard. So we would want to, it would be my recommendation that you all discuss that, and that a recommendation for those thresholds come out of these meetings, so that they have somewhere to start from, so that they have, a recommendation from you all as they move it forward.
Why don't we, Mark, can you explain how you came up with 60%?
I think it just generally the idea that we wouldn't want, we'd want to suggest that a scenario can be well conceived in some areas, but not overall, and still be, legitimately a legitimate expectation of what the city is willing to accept, as far as when it's doing an estimate of how much land is available inside the urban service boundary. So it's one thing if you have a scenario, and I think 60%, I think this is kind of a good indication. We set a relatively simple distinction between scenarios 1, 2, and 3. Scenario 2 just increases basic density and development flexibility on vacant land, it doesn't really take advantage of the opportunities of underutilized land. And that gets you close to meeting, gets you to meet most of your capacity needs. And it gets you close to like addressing a lot of the fundamental planning issues that you're concerned about. I mean, it does end up putting people closer to transit by virtue of just building more units, et cetera. But it wasn't until you do the next big, aspect of your comp plan of redevelopment that you see the scores really, cross that threshold. So I think we wanted to create a bar that's easy enough to cross without having for each scenario to be perfect. But I think at least the way we've seen in this example, you can't just do one thing and one thing only. You have to do both of those big things, increase density and do infill development in order to get even that 60% threshold passed. And I think in the future, to Mr. Penn's point, you don't necessarily need to go all in on redevelopment. And again, we didn't go all in, but we did go relatively comprehensively across the community for redevelopment. But let's say instead of assuming 30% of total infill development potential as we do in scenario 3, we only assumed a 10% development potential, because while we're going to be conventional in a lot of places, we know we want to redo Nicholasville Road. And so we want to give a scenario 2 credit for that. And we end up giving that question of underutilized development, redevelopment underutilized corridors, we give it a 2 or a 3, then yeah, that just little push would say that that's a viable scenario for the community to accept as good enough to answer the question, is there enough land currently inside the urban service boundary that also, to meet our demands, but also generally meet our comp plan goals. So that's a long way of saying that. I mean, it's a lower bar, but it's a meetable bar if you do just enough to kind of touch on all the different areas.
Randall, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I know we've talked about the the threshold. I guess I want to go back to the point scale, and similar to Frank's point on the corridors. When I look at number 19, I guess I'm just trying to understand the positive impact on the finances. It looked like scenario 2 gets a 2 and 3 gets a 4, but that spread of those finances seem to be rather significant. And I guess my mind, I'm still stuck on that at this point, because I think all of these points will really adjust or modify that threshold.
I'm sorry. All these points would adjust or modify the threshold?
Yes, I think we spent some time on the weights, but then we're looking at these the point scale. Maybe that's what I'm struggling with at this point.
Sure. I mean, obviously that's another variable that I think the dichotomy we were trying to establish is an analyst will set the points based on a metric, a data point. And the policy community will set the weight based on their policy preferences of these various questions. The reason why we have a 5-point scale 0 through 4, we originally had a yes, no, a binary choice. Does it improve it or does it not improve it? And we recognize that there probably needs to be more nuance into than beyond a binary choice. But we also wanted to keep it relatively straightforward of, does it do nothing or make things worse? Does it just keep things the same or slightly better, but not really move the needle? Or does it actually improve what's happening? And then we gave, so that's 0, 2, or 4. And then in between, if we still can't really say it's one or the other on the other side of that dial, you can get a 1 or a 3. And so the 1 through 4, or like the 5-point scale, I think is, again, to address that there is nuance, but without creating the same kind of diversity of subjectivity that would be like set on the weights. And John Bucher, I don't know if you had another thought about how we would, on that topic of the weights versus the point scale versus the threshold. I don't know if you want, I might have sprung on a little.
No, I mean, I think you explained that well. I think I was interpreting the question as really why did we decide when we evaluated the scenarios that scenario 2 got 2 points for that, and why did we decide that scenario 3 got 4 points for that? That was the way I understood the question. And so, I think that's one of the things where we had conversations about it. That's where we felt that they fit on that scale. But that is somewhat subjective. When planning staff does this in the future, they may decide that it's a 2 and a 3 or a 2 and a 4. And then the planning commission or the council might decide that they're wrong and they think it's something else. I mean, the idea though was that would be done by planning staff, and hopefully, that would stay with it through the process. That maybe commission and council would be more concerned about the weighting and the thresholds, and allow planning staff to do the analysis that gives it the scores. But again, it's all really who decision makers have to kind of decide that. But that was just our opinion when we evaluated it, that it was a 2 or a 4.
I actually
based on our understanding.
And I actually thought that question was one of the easiest ones to put on that scale, because it was so clear. One was a negative, one was a very, very neutral, and one was like a strong positive. So it wasn't a question of like, well, is it a 2 or a 4? I don't know. It's like one is like literally just at the line of being positive. One is way on the negative side, and one is, way on the positive side. So it wasn't to suggest that there was a dramatic, like that. Would it have been different had it been the difference between 120,000 per year and 3 million per year? I don't know that it would, because it would still, to me, be an affirmative positive, to the point of the question, does it have a positive impact on LVCG finances? Yes. And like that would get you the full square. Now, if it was something that we felt like was really closer to neutral, then I would say it should be a 2. And if it was something that was negative, it should seriously be a 0. I don't, Ms. Phillips.
Yeah, so you're envisioning that staff will assign the weighting, and then the point system will be assigned to planning commission?
No,
the opposite of that.
Okay, the opposite of that.
That the planning commission would do what you all did and update the weighting.
Okay,
And the planning staff would be the ones to score it. And the commission may decide that 60% threshold is sufficient or not sufficient, and may assign another one with recommendations maybe from planning staff on where that should go. But the planning staff would do the points and the scoring based on weights that were decided by commission. That's the way we had understood it.
okay. And I wanted to lob this one towards the vice mayor. So considering what are the political ramifications of going higher or lower than 60 for that threshold?
Well, there's a couple different ways to think about it.
Yeah.
The way that I think about it is that essentially what I think is in the best interest of the community. So this is, I'll just own that. That's my bias here, is not to have a trigger that is too soon. I want to be sure that if in fact we are considering expansion of the urban service boundary, we have really good reason to do it. And so the higher that percentage, the sooner the trigger, and unless I'm misunderstanding something. So we're evaluating scenarios, we're trying to project, and we're updating the scenarios every year. If, as we update a scenario, let's say we've abandoned 1 and 2, we're on 3. We want as much density as possible. And we want to essentially postpone the question of whether we need to expand or not for as long as possible. So 50 gives us more flexibility, and it functionally would postpone the decision of whether now to entertain this question of whether we ought to expand or not.
I don't know that I understand your logic. Are you saying if we lowered the threshold to 50, it would make it
No.
easier for a scenario to pass as acceptable, and therefore, but if it's not really meeting the goals of the comp plan, that doesn't.
What we're doing is projecting meeting the needs of the comp plan. Is that, I mean, let's take it step by step. Is that correct? First of all, we're saying, here's the conditions under which we think the question of expanding ought to be raised. So if if we need 100 houses in 20 years and the projection is we're only going to get 80, if the threshold for triggering the discussion is 50%, we're only looking at 40 houses as opposed to 60%, which is 60 houses. So that.
Okay, you're speaking of the 75% threshold for the meeting the demand quotient for full development.
No, I'm talking about the 60% of this number that we're now looking at. Does that scenario meet 60% of the projected need? The higher the number, the sooner it triggers. Unless there's something I'm not understanding.
It's true. No, that's true for both sides of it.
Okay.
So, you know, the higher that threshold, the sooner you get to the point where you've decided you have to expand.
Right.
So if you set it at 75% of the full demand, then you're going to have to expand. You're going to have to expand sooner than if you set it at 50%. And if you set it at 100%, you're going to have to go ahead and expand now. But that by lowering it, you give yourself more flexibility. And then same way with advancing Imagine Lexington. If a scenario is acceptable at 50% or 60%, then that gives you more flexibility than saying that it has to be 90% or 100%. Because then it's really hard for a scenario to get to where you need to be to not expand. So yeah, I agree with what you're saying and follow your logic. And so I guess the way I would respond is yes, the lower you set your thresholds for both capacity and for meeting Imagine Lexington, the lower you set those thresholds, the longer you can put off expanding the boundary.
I think it's also worth noting that lowering that threshold doesn't remove the need for those policy discussions to perhaps take a look at density and infill and changes that need to happen. It would just essentially delay it. It doesn't remove those conversations from the public forum. It just it adds a little bit of flexibility, like John said, and it provides additional time before expansion would occur, essentially.
Would you like me to stop sharing so people can see faces at this point, or do we still want to look at this?
If scenario 3, the percentage, the score, the rank possible points is 93% for scenario 3, as you now have it, which is above the 60% threshold, meaning that yes, the USP, with that scenario, USB expansion is not warranted. Scenario 2 is currently scored at 54%, which is lower than 60%. So no proposals to expand the USB need to be addressed. So I'm not sure I understand about lowering.
I think the way we would answer that one for scenario 2 is you basically you've got 2 options. You can try to improve it, and you can look and see that you're not getting any points for the underutilized corridors, and rework that scenario, as Mr. Penn said earlier, to do a better job of redevelopment and underutilized corridors, get a few more points, so that you are meeting the threshold if the threshold is 60%, and then you don't need to expand. But if you've already done 10 iterations on it and you're just like, you know what, there's really nothing reasonable we can do to get more points, then you would say maybe we should consider expansion at this time, because we can't meet Imagine Lexington, even though we might be meeting capacity demand, or demand, we have the capacity to meet demand, still not meeting Imagine Lexington. Maybe we do consider some sort of expansion. Doesn't mean you have to, but you might consider it.
So it makes it easier for expansion to be considered if you change this question to, does the improved scenario score above 50%? If you lower the percentage, it makes it easier.
Just the opposite.
Because
It is just the opposite. It's a little counterintuitive, but it is just the opposite.
oh, you're right. I'm sorry. Okay, now I'm with you 100% now. Took me a minute. Thank you.
I think Councilmember Bledsoe is looking for.
Yes, I'm sorry, Councilman Bledsoe.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I was in a luncheon that took a little bit longer time than I had planned. So I got in a little bit late to the conversation. I just wanted to, I guess, say 2 things that I feel like I've said before, but maybe need to be reiterated, which is, the role of the commission and the council, I think, depends on where you sit and who you happen to be. So I get nervous about interpreting the council's role in some of these things, just with Steve and I being on here, because I think when we passed the doing this report and doing this commission, which I was on, however many, several years ago, 3 years ago, the thought was that it would be coming back to council for review, interpretation, influence. So I say that because I think that's going to happen whether people want it to or not. That's the interpretation that we had, is that it was going to come back to council and we would be the ones looking at that report in some form or fashion before it was, moved on too much. And I echo Vice Mayor Kay's thoughts about 60%. I think that's a solid place to be to a certain extent, because once you go, it takes a while. So making it too aggressive, I think, would be hard to get done quickly. And so giving the 60% does allow some time to be forward thinking with an impetus towards movement without so much as like steamrolling, so I think 60 makes a lot of sense as that line. And that's just my gut. That's nothing more than that.
Thank you. Mr. Penn.
I'd like to respond to the process that Councilmember Bledsoe referred to. I don't know whether it goes for the council or it goes for the planning commission or not. I haven't heard that debated one way or the other. My hope would be that it would go for the planning commission first with recommendations, and then we would send it to the council with those recommendations based on implementation. And I'd like to hear Councilmember Bledsoe's response to that.
That might make sense too, Mr. Penn. I think that I got lost when it was kind of saying maybe it wasn't going to go past the commission level. And I just wanted to make sure, at least on the council side, is I think we believed, at least when we passed it originally, that eventually we would have the last say on what that looked like. And I say on triggers or numbers or stances. And I think we would absolutely want the recommendation of this committee and of the commission before reacting to that. I just want to make sure that last step was still at the council level, not stopping at the commission level.
And if I, again, can weigh back
Well,
in.
I don't know about the last say. Go ahead, Steve, please.
Well, let me, I've been thinking about this.
Go ahead, Steve.
So let me read what the comprehensive plan says under goal 4. We know about establishing the process. We know about well, there's some other questions about what the study should and should not include, but basically the last bullet point says, implement the process resulting from the study as an amendment to the comprehensive plan, superseding theme E goal 3 at time of adoption by the Planning Commission. Now, the way I read that, I can get back to where I need to be. The way I read that, that's an amendment to the goals and objectives. That's squarely in the council's purview. That's what unless I misunderstand how the comp plan is actually amended. I believe that always goes to council. And so certainly I have no objection. And typically on these kinds of things, we want the Planning Commission to weigh in, evaluate, work with staff and so on and so on. But the final word is going to have to be, I believe, council.
Then I see your hand up.
Yeah, to respond to Steve, and Tracy Jones is here. Under KRS 100, council is not required. The legislative body is not required to adopt the comprehensive plan, only the goals and objectives. And if this is, construed to be a goal, an update to the goal, then clearly it will have to go before council. But I'm confused with respect to who does the weighting and who does, adds the values. Are we talking about this study going forward, and who takes on roles at that juncture? And then it will be passed on to the staff, who will make recommendations on an annual basis to the Planning Commission for whether or not we need to consider upping the opportunities for more office development, let's say, or more multifamily housing development. And will council be involved at some point in that part of the process?
No.
You don't see so, Frank?
I don't think on a yearly basis they would. I think on a yearly basis, you get a report of where you are. And then the Planning Commission tries to adjust as they go forward to help meet the goals and objectives of that comp plan. I don't think we're going to have, or I don't think it's intended for us to have a full-blown yearly discussion over whether we're going to expand or not. I think the information has to be there, and then that will carry its own weight and create its own set of circumstances. I don't think it's ever intended for this to be a comp plan review every year, Lynn. And that's what you're going to get into if you start trying to make it that way. It's the council, whether it's the Planning Commission. You're going to make those decisions based on 5 to 10 to 15 years out, and you've got to plan for those going forward. And so if we see we're meeting the triggers, then we've got to start getting some infrastructure ideas in place and some other things before you just say, well, we're going to expand. So,
But I agree, Frank, but if the Planning Commission is assigning the weightings, then that politicizes the process. And I'm concerned that council will become engaged. So I'm just concerned about, how this will play out, what it'll look like.
I don't have all the answers, Lynn. I just have an opinion. So
okay, thank you.
So I'll give my opinion too. I don't think council is interested in annual review. I think that's a staff responsibility and a Planning Commission responsibility. And at a certain point, if the thresholds aren't met and essentially the conclusion seems to be now we need to consider, I think then at that point, council probably would want to weigh in on that.
I tend to agree, Steve.
Yeah, the intention from the staff side is for this initial recommendation. Staff would be, the consultant really at this point when this initially goes to the planning commission, and we'd be looking to the planning commission to endorse the weighting. So that would be, if there's any changes made, it would be some adjustments, slight adjustments to the weighting, I would expect. Moving forward on the annual basis, the planning commission would still take a look at that weighting to make sure it's relevant on a year-to-year basis. But planning staff would be in the role of actually updating any scoring as necessary. So I think that just reiterates what was said, but I just thought it'd be worth saying that and
Very well done.
kind of encapsulating all of that.
With that said, if staff finds the current point system acceptable, staff is going to weight it in the future. Why shouldn't they weight it now, as they have?
You mean score it, right?
Score it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Score it. I'm sorry, score it. Yes. Which means I think we should accept the scoring system as it currently stands, and the weighting system has been done as correct as possible, I believe, by taking a poll of all members. So then it boils down to the 60% threshold.
Well, I don't know that I feel good about eliminating the outliers from the weighting that we assigned. There was feedback from 11 members, and aren't there 13 on this task force?
We received responses from 11, so.
But if someone felt very strongly one way or the other, I'm not sure. Again, I would like to see some kind of a printed methodology or an appendix for how you all compile this information, but.
Sure, and we actually do have in the packet, I think it's numbered page 27. We did include a summary of all of the weighted responses that we received.
Yes.
And what we did was we first just calculated the mean, the average based on those 11 responses. But I also took a look at what would happen to that average score if we remove the highest and lowest score we received, and for exactly that purpose, just in case, there were high scores across the board and then one very low score. We just wanted to see what the effect of that was. And generally speaking, as you go down the list here, it was usually no more than 2 to 3/10 of a point was the adjustment. So we didn't find any where there was any very drastic change as a result of removing that highest and lowest score.
And to be clear, we used the average. That analysis that Craig was speaking about was just to see what the variability of the scores were if you took out the outliers.
Yeah, there wasn't a significant change, so we just used the average.
I personally like the 60%, but it's strictly opinion.
Well, I think it gives the staff a starting point. And I think that's what they're looking for from us. If we can agree on that.
Well, I actually think the 50% makes more sense for the reasons I've already addressed, in terms of flexibility, in terms of ability to look at the forecast and see how it is progressing year by year, and not to pull this trigger before we need to. We pulled it in 1995, 1997, and we've had land sitting for 23 years, 20 years plus. So I think we need to be careful about that.
how do we resolve this? It sounds that it's either 50 or 60. Do we take a vote and poll which the committee would like to accept, or what do we do here, folks?
It may be vote time, Greg.
But before we get to that, I wonder if anyone from Stantec or Urban 3 spoke to any other communities that have urban service boundaries. I know that Portland, Oregon continually adjusts their boundary because they're not faced with the same kinds of sociopolitical constraints that we have. But what are the thresholds that are used in other parts of the country? There are, what, 135 communities that use urban service boundaries? Do you all have an answer?
We didn't speak with any particular like planning department. I think we were, so no, I mean, simple answer, no. I think their thresholds are typically they are about the supply of housing, but also much highly relevant to environmental constraints. I don't know, Cynthia, if you have anything to add there, but ours was more of, because we were not examining expansion, it was more of a build out scenario framework. And I think a lot of urban service boundaries are intended to protect what is on the outside and weigh the costs of what would happen to environmental constraints, but also the thresholds are the provision of services, of infrastructure. And so in our case, it's a little bit more specific about what the threshold of what was available inside the urban service boundary for these particular classes of land, and answer that question. And then again, to move forward with, even if you were able to accommodate the demand, are you implying that you're following your comp plan goals? So I think we are in a relatively specific scenario, and I don't know the degree to which all those 138 other urban service boundaries are first of all as strict as ours, but also whether or not their constraints were as directly tied to our scope, which is staying inside the urban service boundary.
Many other communities that have urban service boundaries also have a future land use map, which allows you to calculate in a very straightforward way their capacity essentially to grow. And so we've needed to be a bit more creative with the scenarios and so on, because we're not operating from a place where we have a future land use map with what's going to go where exactly. So it's very difficult to, I did look at some of those communities. It's very difficult to make kind of a one-to-one comparison between Lexington and some of the other communities that have urban service areas for that reason.
What the state of Oregon, state of Washington require for all their communities, but yeah, and they do have different circumstances associated with it, but certainly someone has to. I read a paper, it's been 15 years probably, that Portland actually was looking at average housing prices and the cost of housing as to whether or not they needed to bump out their line, to be able to provide more land for residential development to try to, increase supply, drop prices. But again, that paper is probably 2008, 2007.
I think I would add, Mark, for Lynn's benefit, and to add on to Craig as well, is that in many respects, this plan has gone a lot further than other efforts that are evaluating urban service growth boundaries by providing a range of scenarios, a range of density options, and a range of development patterns, incorporating redevelopment of underutilized property along the corridors, some downtown parking lots that are surface parking. And so by looking at every possible sort of nook and cranny and opportunity for redevelopment, and then spreading that over the course of scenarios and tying that back to specific questions to provide a guide for staff is probably a lot more robust of an effort than other agencies have participated in to provide staff the tools that they need in order to evaluate development proposals. And so I don't want to sound like I'm speaking, in a way that's self-promoting here, but my planning experience over the last 35 years and my understanding and awareness and knowledge of other communities with urban service boundaries, this is a really good template that we've created for staff to be able to make informed decisions that come into their department over time, and then track what is actually occurring in the development marketplace and compare that to what the scenarios options were in 1, 2, and 3, and then to develop their own spreadsheet to the side. And then once a year, just report to the Planning Commission if the community is on track with 1, 2, or 3 as far as the types of development that they are seeing, in order to be aware of whether or not the community is growing in the way that was anticipated in any one of these scenarios. And so I think from the perspective of the urban service boundary, usually, like Mark said, you're looking at the environmental constraints, and certainly cities look at expanding that for purposes of adding more residential with the pretense, well, if we add more, it'll come down in price, which I think all of us on the phone would agree that doesn't usually happen. But
No,
it doesn't usually happen that way. But the goal here for our scope was to not consider the urban service boundary and therefore an expansion, and therefore to provide guidance on what opportunities exist within the city's urban service boundary to meet future growth demands and a wide range of opportunities. And so I think based on that, I think that it's pretty well established and should be a good tool for the staff to use.
Greg Butler, did you have your hand?
Yeah, I was just gonna, as a former Oregon planner, I think that Portland's probably a bad example in that it's a metro government and it's really comprised of several communities that are working in collaboration and fighting each other at the same time. And then a better example would probably be like Bend, Oregon, right? It's a singular city, also with some of the same perspectives as Lexington, right? Trying to protect the culture that lives outside of that urban boundary. And their process is really interesting. It took them 15 years to figure out how to expand their urban growth boundary, what that looked like. And I would say it's much more akin to what we're looking at than the more famous Portland.
What other comments are there amongst this group about the 50 to 60% before I believe we'll take a poll on 50 or 60? Are there any?
Greg, I have one I think is relevant. Regardless of how you do it, it's going to be a real challenge to bring the community along to accept a expansion, and you better have really good reasons of why you want to expand. And therefore, I think the flexibility needs to be there with the 50% instead of the 60, because I'd like for us to be able to think the next time it's not just who votes to expand. The voting part's easy. The trying to make it happen and the political problems that's going to be associated with that requires we have really good reasons for why we're going to do this, let alone the capacity to do it, let alone where and when. All that has to be worked out as you go down the road. But just for these trigger mechanisms, I don't think you want to run up against that too quick, because the assumptions that you're going to use, just like Cynthia said, most of the times the assumptions don't bear out reality. And so we need to be able to separate that. So that, for what it's worth, that's what I think.
With that said, Frank, and I'm a big believer that the answer is typically in the middle. Is 55 the acceptable answer?
I don't know, Greg. I really don't. I think 60 is too high, but maybe 55 is where it ought to be. I don't know.
Amanda?
Well, so I'll just present something, and this not be my view. I just think it depends on where you sit. Some people will say 60 is far too low.
Yes.
And it should be a lot higher. And so you can make arguments on all those lines, right or wrong. People in the community feel that way. So I would be, I think 50 is too low. I think above 60 is too high in terms of a number. That's why I thought 60 was appropriate, because it shows intent to be mindful of planning ahead without looking like it's aggressive. That's why I like 60. And I think it's going to be hard to get there just based on the scenarios we've already given. 60% is still it's not, I don't think we'll get there quickly just based on what we've kind of done so far. So I don't view that as being too aggressive, I guess is the best word, or trying to move it too quickly. Cause just my thought. I mean, if 55 is where everyone lands, that's fine. I just think 60 makes sense.
But we all have our opinions, right or wrong.
I want to resolve this amicably amongst this group. So do we vote on 50 and then 60? Is that an acceptable way to proceed? I think if you introduce 3 possibilities, it dilutes the process quite a bit.
Yeah.
I think we stick to 50 and 60.
Very good. If every voting member could make sure their screen is on, which I believe that is currently the case, who is in favor of 50? And Craig, if you could be the hand counter, and if you could count aloud and make sure that everyone is in agreement of the count. So who's in favor of 50?
Seeing 5.
Well, the second question is a bit irrelevant. Who's in favor of 60?
2.
Very good. The 50 wins out.
Can I add one more comment?
Sure.
And I've referred to this before, and I've mentioned it before, but I think this might be the moment to add it in. To be clear, I guess first I'd like to agree with what Cynthia said about the work that's been done so far. I think it's going to be a very great tool for the community and for the Planning Commission. I think it identifies the right data and a way to both get it and to update it. And it provides at least a framework for thinking about how you then make your judgments about the relative merits of each of the pieces of data. So I think it's going to be very helpful. But there's another piece, and that piece is the rural land. And once again, if I might, I want to read what the comp plan says about what we are supposed to be doing. We know goal 4 says to protect Lexington's invaluable rural resources, and we know it's to establish a process via a study. What we don't as often remember is that the second bullet under goal 4 says, ensure the study designates rural land for long-term preservation, identifies land for potential future urban development, and specifies triggers, thresholds, and timing for the addition of the identified urban land into the urban service boundary, keeping infill and land use efficiency as the continued primary objective. So while I value what's been done so far, I do want to point out that from my perspective, this committee's work is not done. That in order to, when we think about considering an expansion, a part of what we have to do is look at existing rural land and determine if there are acres that could reasonably be developed without negatively impacting another part of our economic engine, which is the farm community, or the tourist community, or the tourist dollars that we generate with the rural landscape, and other things, environment, sewerability, et cetera. So I think this is a good start on one piece of that. But I want to be clear that this is not yet what is envisioned in the goals and objectives of the comp plan.
Well said.
Do we want this committee to make a recommendation related to that for the continuation of the committee's existence or something of the kind?
So I believe if the intention was to put together a process that replaces the battles that we've had about expansion, that we're not done. And so, yes, I would say we've got another piece of work to do.
Craig, can you provide comment? Your opinion?
So the specific charge of this group was to not look outside of the boundary, essentially. That was the way it was framed to me when we started this process, understanding that this is step one in all of this, that in the future, we will need to take a look at the rural service area, and we will need to take a look at areas outside the boundary that would be appropriate for growth and expansion, so that we're ready for those things when they happen, if and when they happen. So that's, I mean, that's, I'm not sure if that's the answer you're looking for, but that's all I have to offer today. I was under the impression or under the charge of moving this forward, developing this process for identifying when, if and when expansion is necessary, with the understanding that the Planning Commission would take up kind of a step two and further the rest of those tasks.
Craig, that's exactly the way that I understand it as well, when the mayor discussed it with me to head this up. So I think what she has asked us to do in this respect, I think with this, we will have accomplished this. Now, where we go from here, I don't know, but I do feel like we will have accomplished our task that we set forth to do, 6 or 7 months ago.
I agree with you, Ann, completely. I'm also willing to have someone ask for it to be furthered. So at the moment, we'll leave that up to the planning staff and to take it away from there. Is that reasonable, Craig?
I think so. Yes, sir.
Okay. Craig, do you want to discuss the July 19th public input meeting?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So we have scheduled a public input meeting next Monday, this coming up Monday, the 19th at 6 p.m. That meeting will be held via Zoom. The letter that we emailed out to the community on this is the last page, I believe, in your packet today. Let me confirm that that's true. It is. It's page 28 in your packet. Chris Woodall and Jim Duncan were very helpful in sending this out to the same kind of email listserv that they've put together for comprehensive planning efforts to make sure that we're really getting the word out about this. In addition to that, we've placed it on the city calendar, and we have also placed it on, of course, the study's website. So it's in those 3 locations. We'll also be sending out reminders on Friday and Monday, trying to increase any participation that we can get. I'd be glad to, I'm going to add the task force members as panelists and send you invites if you'd like to attend the meeting. We'd love to have you there. It'd be great to have you there. The agenda that we're looking at for the meeting, we're looking at doing just a very quick overview of the summary of the stakeholder meetings that were held at the beginning of this process, and then go into the existing conditions and growth trends report. Again, just at a high level, providing a summary, because what we're really trying to get to, and what we'll be spending the bulk of that meeting on, is discussing the evaluation framework and receiving some public input, public impressions of that. So that's really why we wanted to get to the point where we had input from you today on that 50% threshold. And we will be presenting much of the same information that you saw today to the public in order to get their input. And our intention is to bring that input very quickly, turn that around, and present any themes that come up during that meeting to you next Wednesday during your meeting. Your meeting on the 21st, I believe it is. So we will provide you with input regarding that public meeting at that time. And if appropriate, we would ask at that time for a final recommendation, essentially, from this task force to the Planning Commission so that we can report out to the Planning Commission. So that's the input I have for you today. I'm glad to answer any questions.
I do have a question. I went to the website, and the last document that was posted, it was dated March 25. So so far as I know, there's not been any information on that since then. And so there's not right now available to the public the report that was presented to us that I made a couple of suggestions about. That's not posted. The notes from all those meetings aren't posted.
All of the meeting notes were updated yesterday, and the report was finalized and posted to the website today. So I will definitely double check, because all that information should be and really needs to be on the website. Current. The only thing that's not currently on the website that I'm aware of is we're still working on getting some of the videos of these meetings edited so that they start at the appropriate time when people view them. But everything else should be on there. All of the meeting packets, the existing conditions report should be on there under the second tab on there, and so on. So I'm glad you told me that. I'll be glad to double check that.
I'll look again. I looked this morning.
Yeah, I want to make one point caveat. While we were talking, I was looking to existing conditions report. And I realized I wanted to fix one thing. So I'm going to have to respool the PDF and put it back up there, but that'll be up very, very soon. I just need to fix that one little error I saw while I was up.
Thank you.
And that report, Vice Mayor, that report was just added today, not too long before this meeting, but the meeting information for Monday, the public input meeting was on there by noon yesterday, I believe it was.
Yeah, I see.
Because we're asking people to register for that. So we definitely wanted to get the meeting info out as soon as we could.
Any other committee member comments?
I want to thank you and Ann for a good job.
Thank you. Thank you
You're
all.
very kind.
You are
You've had a lot of teamwork.
agreed. Craig, should we open it up to the attendees and see if there's any comment? We'd ask that people would limit their public comment to 3 minutes or less if they do have comment. Brittany Rothman.
Ms. Rothmeyer, I brought you into the meeting. If you can turn on your video, appreciate it.
Good afternoon, task force members. I will keep this brief, but I just wanted to applaud you all for your work and consideration and thoughtfulness and intentionality. As you all have approached these issues, they're incredibly complicated and nuanced for me who studies these on a regular basis. And I know for all of you who have full-time jobs other than this. So I just wanted to say thank you for your work. I am excited as we get to the end of this process to have what's forming up to be a really useful tool moving forward as we think about growth in Lexington and the urban services boundary. So again, just wanted to applaud you all for your work and thank you for all of your time and commitment as we approach the end of this process, which will hopefully really positively inform our decisions and discussions around this. So thank you all again.
Thank you for your interest and involvement. Any other comments amongst the attendees?
If there's anyone in the attendees room that'd like to speak, please raise your blue hand and we'll bring you into the meeting. Chairs, I'm not seeing any.
All righty. Great meeting, everyone.
Yes, very well. Thank you. Shall we adjourn? Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Thank you.
Hi. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.